Hello. This program is about an important concept in political theory, the concept of sovereignty. More specifically, it's about the question of whether there has been a loss of sovereignty in the United Kingdom as it has become more closely integrated with the European community. The program focuses this question through the study of a specific case, where the European Court of Justice overrides decisions taken within the British judicial institutions. The program reminds us that the question of sovereignty isn't only a matter of the drama of nations and big questions like that. It does touch the everyday life of ordinary citizens. But it poses an even more interesting and to some extent surprising question. What does the concept of sovereignty mean now? You should pay particular attention to what the four senior political figures and the European judge is saying about this concept and whether it has any use for us at the end of the 20th century.
Great Britain, to begin with, has lost an empire and has not yet found a role.
In 1990, it appears that Britain's role lies within Europe. But this has only come about after an intense and bitter national debate. Nor has this debate been concluded. It still evolves around the question of sovereignty. The issue of sovereignty is closely linked to the role that Britain plays in the world. So to understand it fully, we have to consider the changing position of Britain's place in the world since the Second World War. With victory in 1945, Britain's role in the world seemed clear. Together with the United States and the Soviet Union, she planned the peace and redrew the map of Europe. Britain continued its pre-war role as a great power. But how long could this last? With a severely damaged economy and post-war austerity, it soon became apparent that Britain no longer had the resources to sustain the role of a global power. The post-war period was dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union. Their antagonism led to crisis almost as soon as the war was over. Alliances were formed. Britain played a vital role in the creation of NATO.
And in giving an assurance to mankind of our determination to assist all the peoples of the world to live in understanding and good neighborliness.
But as the world split into two camps, it became clear that Britain was simply not in the same league as the superpowers, to east and to west. But what about the empire on which the sun never set? Well, in 1947, India, the jewel in the imperial crown, was given its independence. And the colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean followed. By the end of the 1960s, Britain had indeed lost all but a few fragments of an empire. So where was Britain's new role? Some looked across the Atlantic. The ties of language and history, affirmed during the wartime alliance, led many to believe in a special relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States. Britain's role would be that of the United States' voice in Europe and its special ally across the world. This belief was based on some substance, but the relationship was not always easy and never one between equals. While some looked to the United States, others looked to Europe for a new role. And in 1961, Britain applied for membership of the European communities, but to no avail.
A staggering blow is dealt to Western unity in this council hall in Brussels when France blackballs Britain from the common market.
France vetoed British membership because, ironically, General de Gaulle feared the closeness of the United Kingdom to the United States. 10 years later, however, Britain's application succeeded, and Edward Heath signed the Treaty of Accession to the European Communities.
And Britain, with her Commonwealth links, has also much to contribute to the universal nature of Europe's responsibilities. Europe is more than Western Europe alone.
But the debate about Britain's membership went on and resulted in a unique political event.
On Thursday, we are being asked to vote for the first time in our long history in a referendum. It is a unique vote because it cuts across party differences. Over the last few weeks, Conservative, Liberal and Labour Party leaders have been travelling the country talking to all sorts of people in all sorts of places. Whatever their differences, on this issue, these politicians are united as never before. This is what they say.
I think if we come out, we will be a country which turns in on itself, which has no sense of responsibility beyond itself. And I think, if I may put it very, very directly, I think that would break our hearts as a country, because I think we've got to have a bigger vision than that.
It seems to me that the American politician who said that Britain had lost an empire and not yet found a role was absolutely right. Here is a role for us.
If by chance we were to say no on Thursday, we couldn't chop and change again quickly. Europe would then have to go its road, and we would have to go our road. And I believe that our road would be a hard and a dismal one, a lonely road, leading nowhere.
On Thursday, vote yes. Keep Britain in Europe.
The nation did vote yes. Britain stayed in Europe. But the idea of the special relationship and of a wider world role for Britain didn't go away.
Let us have a Europe which plays its full part in the wider world, which looks outward, not inward, and which preserves that Atlantic community, that Europe on both sides of the Atlantic, which is our noblest inheritance and our greatest strength. May I thank you for the privilege of delivering this lecture in this great hall to this great college.
Her punchline wasn't lost on those who applauded her. She'd chosen to end by emphasizing Britain's Atlantic perspective rather than her European one, the very nub of the objection that President de Gaulle took to Britain's membership of the community 2 decades ago.
So how does the special relationship look in 1990?
Very understandably, we see Britain at the center of world events, a major player in the international community. But the view from the White House is rather different. Robert Hunter was National Security Advisor to President Carter.
Well, there is no question of a special relationship in the sense of the common language, common heritage, the fact that Americans instinctively look to Britain to get a hearing as a place where we will have a friend in court, so to speak, in Europe. But when it comes to a question of who we listen to, who we accommodate to, who we really relate to when it comes to the cutting-edge issues, economically, politically, in security terms, I'm afraid Britain is not particularly special. In this decade, we've looked, in fact, more to France in many cases, and of course, we look more to West Germany than to any other European country.
President Kennedy said to me when I was doing the negotiations, first negotiations in 1962 when he came on a private visit, he said, I want, my vision of the alliance is 2 tall, strong pillars, one on each side of the Atlantic. I said to him, Mr. President, you've got a tall, strong pillar. We in Europe have got a short and rather shaky one. He said, that's why I want Britain in the community, and I'll do everything I can to back you. And I've told my people they've got to be very discreet. And he helped us.
I think the general view here in Washington is that a Britain that is not foursquare in the community is one that will be increasingly impoverished and increasingly isolated from the main currents of events on the continent. And frankly, it's a Britain that we'd have a lot of nostalgia for, but which would have far less influence even than today in the United States government.
And what's the view from Brussels?
We accept that there is a special role to be played by the Brits. They have, for instance, from the language point of view, they have a very good advantage when they speak with the United States. Okay, let's use that advantage. We can also benefit from it. On the other hand, I think the UK could benefit from certain experience which its European neighbours have got with the United States.
We've traditionally looked outwards. We've had the British Empire and the Commonwealth. We've got the so-called special relationship with the United States. And we've tended a little bit to look down on the foreigners the other side of the channel. I think that is changing dramatically. Opinion polls show people are much more wedded now to the European concept, the idea of growing together and so on. I think it's essential that we do for the sake of the British economy and the British place in the world.
If we would like to negotiate with the United States about trade affairs, imagine what it would mean if the UK had to deal with it separately, besides the UK, the Dutch, the Germans, and on and so forth. The only winner would be the United States, because then they can play one against the other, and indeed, we would be the loser.
We haven't yet quite come to terms, I think, with working with other European partners to create a European community as a third force, if you like, between the United States and the Soviet Union in political terms, although that may be changing with the developments in Eastern Europe, and a third force between the United States and Japan in economic terms. I think it's necessary, absolutely vital, that we do work with our partners to create a community.
The United Kingdom is a very important country with a large history, very important history, but it doesn't mean that that history as such is a sufficient guarantee that its future can be ensured on its own. The UK does need Europe, and we indeed in Europe do need the UK.
But membership of the European community poses a problem of political principle.
The right to rule ourselves. This is at the heart of the matter. Neil Martin, Conservative MP for Banbury, and the two greatest parliamentarians of our time, Michael Foot and Enoch Powell.
I think we all disagree, often violently, on policies, but one thing we're all three united on is that if we remain in the common market, it will mean, I think, a grave threat to British independence and to our right to govern ourselves. Michael.
If we stay in the market, there's no doubt at all that the power and authority of the British Parliament are going to be greatly reduced. There can't be any honest argument, at least, about that.
It's important that the electorate at this referendum shouldn't imagine that this is some airy-fairy theory about what might happen in 20 or 40 years' time. This is a present reality.
Peace and stability demands trade with all countries.
On Thursday, reassert the right to rule ourselves.
It's a question of sovereignty, and this too hasn't gone away since the referendum. But just what is sovereignty? I asked two eminent parliamentarians. First, Enoch Powell, a former Conservative cabinet minister.
The test of sovereignty lies in the people themselves. The United Kingdom is that country of which the sovereign authority is the Crown in the Parliament of the United Kingdom. And the people themselves constantly renew, I don't want to use the word contract, renew the reality of the United Kingdom by sending their representatives there. The use of the word sovereignty in a British context brings out one characteristic of a British state, and that is that it is a monarchy, that the powers which are exercised by the state are not the result of a compact made between warring parties in the past, or of a piece of paper which has been signed in the past. They are the consequence of things always having been so, of a continuity, of I'm going to say loyalty, and then I'm going to substitute affection towards the source of authority. Because in the end, the mystery of how men choose to obey is connected with something which it is difficult to define otherwise than in terms of natural affection.
Tony Benn, a former Labour cabinet minister, offers a slightly different emphasis, but the essential point is similar.
Sovereignty is a very clear concept. The right to make the laws by electing people to make them, and of having judges who interpret the laws you make. I understand sovereignty to be the legal basis of the power of lawmaking. Now, when William the Conqueror tried to get us into the common market in 1066, he took the power by conquest. He was the sovereign. And the argument about what is sovereign has been a central argument in British history. In the 17th century, when Charles I was executed, he claimed he had the divine right to govern. And Parliament said, we have the right. You cannot govern without consent. And therefore, sovereignty in its legal sense passed first from the Crown through perhaps the landowners at Magna Carta, to the Lords, to the Commons, and then through the struggle to extend the franchise to the people. The people are sovereign. In a democracy, that's the only meaning of it. The people are sovereign.
The essence of sovereignty, to both Benn and Powell, is that a nation must retain the legal authority to legislate over its own affairs. There can be little doubt that membership of the European community has limited the sovereignty of the United Kingdom. A good illustration of this is the case of Helen Marshall. The story begins in Southampton, where the ancient bar gate carries symbols of sovereignty, and a reminder of an earlier period when Britain was part of another kind of European community. Helen Marshall worked as a hospital dietitian. From 1966 until 1980, she was employed by the Southampton and South West Hampshire Health Authority.
The authority had a policy of dismissing or retiring women when they reached the age of 60 and men when they reached the age of 65. They sometimes relaxed the policy, and in Helen Marshall's case, they allowed her to remain until the age of 62 when they dismissed her.
I got this shock that I think everybody gets when suddenly they've got no job. And for me, it was increasingly final because they said it was retirement, which meant it rather hampered my style of looking for something else to do. And so, at that point, I felt aggrieved, I suppose.
Did the Sex Discrimination Act, in fact, allow this differential treatment between men and women?
It had been decided by the Court of Appeal that it did, yes. And that wasn't actually challenged in the proceedings. It was accepted that if Miss Marshall relied on the English statute alone, then she had to fail.
So, just to clarify the position, the Health Authority was behaving entirely properly?
The Health Authority was behaving in accordance with the Sex Discrimination Act.
Well, I suppose I thought that the Sex Discrimination Act was being read wrongly, or rather my case wasn't being put correctly, because I thought my case was a case of employment, and the Health Authority were handling it as one as retirement, and that was where the problem came in from there.
So she took the authority to the Industrial Tribunal, alleging that they had discriminated against her on the ground of her sex by dismissing her when she wouldn't have been dismissed if she had been a man. The authority said that this was lawful under the English statute, the Sex Discrimination Act, and they relied on an exception in the Act which excluded from the prohibition of discrimination provision in relation to death or retirement. And this has been interpreted by the Court of Appeal as including the date at which employees are made to retire.
So I obviously couldn't make any headway there. So I happened to hear, I think it was on the BBC, a case where a woman had taken her case from national courts to Europe. And so I wrote and asked them about it. I discovered that if I worked my way up English courts, I could then hopefully go to Europe with the case. So that was how really the procedure went ahead.
Miss Marshall countered that under the Equal Treatment Directive adopted by the Council of the European Communities, she was entitled to equal treatment in working conditions, including conditions governing dismissal. And her case was that this overrode the English statute. So that was the field of play between the two parties. And in fact, the Industrial Tribunal back in 1980 held that her claim was well-founded, that the Equal Treatment Directive applied, that it overrode the exception in English law, and that she was entitled to rely on it to maintain her claim that she'd been discriminated against. So right from that stage, it was clear that the case was a European case or nothing.
The Health Authority took the case to the Employment Appeal Tribunal in London. The Equal Opportunities Commission provided Miss Marshall with a barrister, but to no avail.
The Health Authority appeal was upheld. And I think, to me, that was another eye-opener for the looking at the courts, because somehow it hadn't quite dawned on me that in our courts, one side has got to fail. And the fact that if I'd done it myself and failed, I would have been very, not exactly depressed. I would have thought that I was not up to doing the case, whereas because it was lawyers who had lost the case, I felt that, somebody's got to do.
Miss Marshall appealed the judgment to the Court of Appeal, also in London. The Court of Appeal, in turn, asked the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg for a ruling.
But I decided I would like to see what Luxembourg was going to be like. And so I went over to Luxembourg and I looked round and I went to the Court of Justice. And that, of course, is so completely different from, say, Court of Appeal. I mean, the Court of Appeal is corridors and corridors and very confusing. The Court of Justice is just beautiful, I thought, or that was my impression, with some lovely art structures. There's a very beautiful Rodin statue. If you're going over there, I'm sure you'll see it. I felt an openness, which I think a young court can possibly do. That is a court of 30 years standing, a bit more than that, and as opposed to our own, which is from the Magna Carta. And so I really enjoyed it there. There was the bench of 7 judges, and then there were all the lawyers. And so really, I mean, I was just not there. And I was listening with the earphones in a seat at the back.
The Marshall case was argued in this courtroom, and in February 1986, the judges delivered their verdict.
The government is changing the laws on sex discrimination so that women can go on working as long as men if they want to. But it doesn't affect the age at which they'll qualify for the state pension. That'll still be 60. The changes are being made because of a ruling by the European Court.
It's the case of Helen Marshall that is forcing the government to change the law. A former health service dietitian, she was made to retire at the age of 62. But when she took her case to the European Court, it ruled that women should not be discriminated against by being forced to retire earlier than men. The new legislation planned by the government will give women the right to continue working to the same age as men, although it falls short of demands for a common retirement age.
The Court of Justice is perhaps the least known of the European Community institutions. The most familiar community institution is probably the Commission, based here in Brussels. The Commission is the administrative arm of the community. It also devises the measures which become community law. The European Parliament plays a largely advisory role, although its influence is increasing. Legislative power continues to lie with the Council of Ministers, consisting of the appropriate ministers from member state governments, who have the authority to accept or reject the measures proposed by the Commission. The Court of Justice consists of 13 judges, one from each member state, plus one more, usually from one of the larger member states.
L'audience est ouverte. Madame le greffier, voulez-vous faire l'appel de l'affaire?
Wisseling en Abeme tegen de staatssecretaris van Financiën.
Maître Van Vliet, s'il vous plaît.
The court's role is to interpret and apply the whole body of community law, from the basic treaties to the various regulations, directives and decisions. It hears cases brought against community institutions and against member states.
In te gaan op de gewisselde schriftelijke stukken.
And it has a third role, which is the one it played in the Marshall case.
It also acts in close collaboration with the national courts, because national courts, when faced with a problem of European community law, can always ask the Court of Justice for a ruling on a matter of interpretation of community law, or even on a matter of validity of certain regulations of the Council of Ministers, or decisions of the Commission, and so on. So they refer the matter more or less to the court, and we have here proceedings before the court, and then give a ruling, which is then binding upon the national court in question.
The national court in question in Miss Marshall's case, you'll remember, was the Court of Appeal. The questions it put to the Court of Justice concerned Council Directive 76/207, which is about equal treatment for men and women in matters of working conditions. The first question was one of interpretation.
Miss Marshall's case was that equal treatment in working conditions, including conditions governing dismissal, meant that differential retirement ages were prima facie, on the face of it, unlawful. The Health Authority, which was backed by the United Kingdom government, argued that, when properly interpreted, that didn't include retirement ages. And the European Court held that those exceptions were limited to pensions, and that as far as the retirement age was concerned, Article 5 of the directive, as it was, did prohibit differential retirement ages.
I think the question as to whether there was discrimination or not against Miss Marshall was not particularly difficult. It was obvious that she had to retire at a different age from a man, and that on the face of it was a differentiation or perhaps discrimination.
So having established that, the second question was whether Miss Marshall, as an individual, could rely on the European directive directly before her court, or whether it was subject to, it had to be enacted by the British Parliament.
The rules on equal treatment, which were in question in the Marshall case, had been decreed in what we call a directive, which is a very particular kind of legislation, because we have regulations and directives. And the regulations, they are just like statutes, so to say. They have rules, as we say, which are directly applicable, and everybody can resort to them, can rely on them before any court, also before national courts. The directives are a different kind of instruments. They give rules which have to be translated into national law by the national legislature. And the problem before the court is always, what is the legal situation when the member state concerned did not entirely translate the provisions of the directive into its own national law?
And what the European Court held was that the directive, which prohibited discrimination, was clear, it was precise. After the time for implementing it had passed, which it had, it was unconditional, and that it was binding on the state, and that the state, which hadn't adopted legislation in conformity with the directive, could not get out of its obligations under the directive against Miss Marshall by holding up in its defense its own failure to enact legislation.
And the real issue was whether the government could be heard to say, well, we haven't adopted the directive, therefore you can't rely on community legislation. And the court, following a previous decision, said, rightly, that if a government doesn't, or Parliament doesn't adopt the necessary legislation, it can't be heard to say to a citizen, well, too bad, we haven't done anything about it. Where the Marshall case went further than anything before was in saying that in the employment relationship, she could rely on her rights or she could enforce the directive against the government. It was a very important decision.
The Court of Justice handed down its ruling to the Court of Appeal. Miss Marshall won her case and British law was changed. Does she have any qualms about, in effect, taking her own government to a European court?
Well, so far as I'm concerned, I feel that that court has given me a wider freedom. And therefore, I don't think it can be bad. Now, I've been to Europe. I'm just as British as I ever was, but I am more European. And therefore, I find it gives me confidence to hear things that Europe is doing, because I know it's part of a team of which Britain is a member. And if Europe approves of some international action, or disapproves of it for that matter, I feel it has a more balanced feeling about it.
By the time the Court of Justice gave its ruling, Helen Marshall was 65, so she didn't go back to work. At the time of filming in 1990, she was still fighting a legal battle over the amount of compensation she was due for the years of employment she had lost. But where does loss of sovereignty come in? One aspect of the loss is that a non-British court made a ruling which was binding on a British court.
Parliament itself decided that we should join the community. Parliament adopted the European Communities Act. Parliament laid down what it was we were accepting. Parliament accepted that the rulings of this court would be binding on the national courts insofar as community law was concerned. And sometimes we decide things which means that the national courts no longer decide them. But that's part of the package that we took when the United Kingdom came into the community. I think people talk too much and get too frightened about losing sovereignty. We got benefits by coming in, and we had to give something up by coming in. And I don't think there's been any terrifying encroachment on sovereignty.
Another aspect of the loss of sovereignty is that Miss Marshall's victory established the supremacy of a community directive over a British statute. Directives are proposed by the Commission and adopted by the Council of Ministers, a process which bypasses the British Parliament altogether.
When I went as a minister to Brussels and agreed to some proposal, I wasn't using parliamentary authority. I was using the power of treaty making, which is a prerogative power. So you've had this extraordinary throwback in domestic politics from the right of Parliament elected by the people to make the laws back to a royal prerogative used by a Prime Minister who can only be removed, if you know what I mean, by an overturning of the whole of his or her government in the House of Commons in a general election, which is never done. So you've got that. But the second thing is that the laws that are made, or the directives and regulations are made, apply in Britain without any parliamentary approval. Then if a government is elected that does something that runs counter to the Treaty of Rome or a regulation made by the Commission, any British company can go to any British court and say the actions of an elected British government are illegal, and the court will be required to interpret community law over British law. We have reduced the Parliament we elect to municipal impotence. And as I say, I think this is a time bomb ticking away in our society, which will explode one day.
For Enoch Powell too, such a loss of sovereignty is profoundly important and underlay his opposition to UK membership of the European Community.
I was opposed to Britain being governed otherwise than by itself, which of course is a metaphorical statement. There isn't a real reflexive to the verb to govern. But what I meant was that the House of Commons, elected by the people of this country, ought not to transfer its basic powers to any other authority. In that sense, that the British people ought to continue to be self-governed. They should continue to have control over their laws, over their taxes, and over the policy of the government in office. That was attenuate in form in the most comprehensive way, ended by accession to the Treaty of Rome through the Treaty of Brussels, and now at last, after a lapse of 17 years, people are beginning to see the reality of a transfer. and they're not liking it. And I'm not surprised they're not liking it. But that's another question, perhaps.
In their concern over sovereignty, Enoch Powell and Tony Benn have much in common, even though they would disagree on many other political issues. On the other hand, there are politicians from all political parties who support Europe. For them, the loss of sovereignty is not a matter of concern.
Sovereignty exists to be used, and to be used for the benefit of the people, our fellow citizens. Sovereignty isn't something you take down and put in the cellar and go down once a week with a candle to see if it's still there. It's meant to be used, and it's up to our judgment as to how best we use it, and the best way we can use it is in the European community. What we have done is to pool part of our sovereignty. The other members of the community, now 11 other members, have also pooled part of their sovereignty. And when we take decisions, we have a say in their sovereignty in exactly the same way as they have in ours. It's therefore fully justified to achieve the results we want.
So, for Edward Heath, it's important to distinguish between sovereignty and effectiveness, a view shared by the Liberal Democrat, Lord Jenkins of Hill Head, a former Labour Cabinet Minister and former President of the European Commission.
One has to try and distinguish between whether one's talking about the legal fiction, as I would regard it, of sovereignty, or whether one's talking about the broad issue of how you best influence your own political destiny. You could legislate saying that the Bundesbank shall never make changes in its interest rate policy which will have any effect upon this country, and therefore effect upon what people pay in mortgages. You could legislate to that effect, but it would be ludicrously meaningless, because it would have absolutely nil effect at all. You could legislate saying that Japan ought to take have more imports from Britain, but it would be absolutely meaningless in that way. And there are all sorts of things going on in the world on which the legal figment of sovereignty can't really make an impact at all. And therefore you have to decide how, when you're dealing with these important issues, increasingly important issues in the integrated world of today, you can best act in a way that protects and advances British interests. And my view is that if you're dealing with the impact of interest rates, for instance, you would probably get further by pooling a bit of your sovereignty and playing a role in determining what the interest rate policy of the Bundesbank or of a European Central Bank was, than by just crouching in solitary isolation. And equally, if you're going to negotiate with Japan, you're more likely to be able to do it effectively on the basis of a major European trading bloc than doing it in isolation.
How does Tony Benn respond to this argument that power and effectiveness are more important than sovereignty?
A country like Britain, a medium-sized country, is continually under pressure from bankers, from multinationals, from Rupert Murdoch and Robert Maxwell and Stevens, who own all the newspapers and television things. These are pressures, but you can decide how to respond to the pressure. Within these, you can't. The decision as to the laws are made by others. If you don't like it, you can't do anything about it. So I think what we're talking about here is the transfer of the power to respond, not the power to control. Nobody can control. You're confusing sovereignty with omnipotence. Nobody's omnipotent. The Americans, the most powerful country in the world, could be destroyed by a bomb dropped from anywhere else in the world.
I put it to Enoch Powell that the UK has already given up sovereignty, for instance to NATO and the IMF, in return for effectiveness.
Take the case of NATO, which you mentioned first. It is still the Parliament of the United Kingdom, in fact the House of Commons of the United Kingdom, which controls the defence policy and the defence expenditure of the United Kingdom government. And the government of this country still has to answer to the people of this country through Parliament for whatever is done by the way of stationing of troops or the manufacture or maintenance of weapons. Otherwise, we are going to lose these fundamental debates from the public forum in this country. And I'm sure that the people of this country still want to decide these matters themselves insofar as they have to be implemented by the United Kingdom. So your example of NATO, in a sense an extreme example, proves the point.
So for Enoch Powell and Tony Benn, the legal authority to make laws and decisions, to retain sovereignty, is paramount. But it can be argued that sovereignty is not only irrelevant, but may be dangerous.
The fact is that people talk about sovereignty as though we'd had it ever since Adam and Eve. It's a 19th century concept very largely. And where did it lead us to? It led us to 3 European wars, the second 2 of which became world wars, because of struggles between nation states. That's why my generation, those of us who survived the Second World War, were determined that it shouldn't happen again. That's why we've embraced them in a community. And we don't want the opportunity of these individual little nation states to wage wars against each other. No, we want to be a community in the truest sense of the word. We are one world. And why are we one world? We were one world at war, as Wendell Willkie said. But now we're one world at peace because of the development of communications. It doesn't matter what happens in the world today. You hear it immediately on the radio. You hear it within a few minutes, you see it within a few minutes on television. And everybody in the world can see it. It doesn't matter whether you're in number 10 in the Prime Minister's study or in the White House in the Oval Room or whether you're in Malaysia. This is the modern world. And to stand there and say, I'm going to maintain my sovereignty, come what may, is not only out of date, but ridiculous, because you're damaging yourself.
Well, I think we live in a world in which what happens in other parts of the world influences us increasingly directly. This applies perhaps particularly in the economic and the monetary field, but by no means exclusively so. Increasingly as being the case in the environmental, the ecological field. Long been a question in the defense field. No nation could think of defending itself in complete isolation. And therefore, in reality, the concept on which complete preservation of one's own sovereignty might be based are illusory. And my view is if you try to cling to the shadow of sovereignty too much, you allow the substance to fly out of the window to an even greater extent than it need do. But I say I prefer always to redefine it in terms of how you can best exercise control over your own destiny, and not in terms of any narrow attachment to preserving inviolate Dicey's concept of sovereignty, which may have been out of date even when he started talking about it 100 years ago.
There are people who write about international relations. They talk about an interdependent world and a new global order.
I do wish they wouldn't. This notion that we are more dependent on other nations than they ever were, or than we have been for a long time, I think is misconceived. Trade and our dependence upon it, and the significance of trade with the outside world for the internal affairs of this country is nothing new whatsoever. And yet we didn't have people in the last century rushing around saying, now we're internationally dependent. I see no connection between the developments of technology and science and the decision which ought to be retained by the people of this country over the laws by which they are governed and the taxes they pay and the policies which their politicians pursue.
The only definition of sovereignty that I understand is the democratic one. Do we or do we not have the power to elect and remove the people who pass the laws under which we are governed? And those laws may be laws or administrative decisions that protect us as far as we can from external pressures, which will always be brought to bear on us, whether it be an external military threat, an external monetary threat, an external multinational threat, an external pollution threat. How do we respond? If you lose the power to respond, you've lost your sovereignty.
The argument will, no doubt, go on. For the moment, I'll give the last word to the European Court.
The United Kingdom Parliament is not sovereign, of course. There is a council in Brussels which gives rules. There is a commission in Brussels which decides on certain topics. There's a court here which gives rulings which are binding for United Kingdom courts, and which are also sometimes binding on the government. So I have the feeling that the notion of sovereignty is not something that can really explain what is happening in the west of Europe. But we are still looking for the good notions to replace the notion of sovereignty. And I must recognize, of course, that in some respects, especially with regard to the relationship between the British courts and the British Parliament, the notion of sovereignty of Parliament still has a certain meaning. I see that quite well. But it is not a concept that really helps to explain the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European community.
Well, Richard, has there been a loss of sovereignty, in fact?
I think there's been no doubt, Stuart. If you look at the programme, the case of Helen Marshall shows that here were decisions which had an enormous effect on this woman's life, and they were taken by European institutions and not by British institutions. It was European judges and not British judges who finally ruled on this matter. I think the case shows, without a doubt, that there's been a loss of sovereignty.
And do you think this matters? I mean, in any real sense? What about the argument that's advanced in the programme that, after all, the British Parliament did decide to give up part of its sovereignty, so it can hardly, as it were, say it's lost something which it ought to have kept? Is that a real defence?
Well, I think there are two views on this, as we've seen in this programme. I think there are people who feel that this is a profoundly important subject. Tony Benn and Enoch Powell make it clear that they see this as the very essence of nationhood, and this has been ceded by the United Kingdom to the European community. And there is the other view that it's a legal formality, a mere fiction. And I suppose this is something that the students will have to ponder and think about.
Well, now, we usually assume that concepts like sovereignty are pretty, stable and long-lasting, that once you've discovered what the term means, you can go on using it as a form of analysis of political systems. But what seems to be said at the end of the programme is that actually this concept is changing its meaning as it goes through time. Is the concept of sovereignty any longer of any use to us?
Again, it's a very, very difficult problem to grapple with. And it's clearly the case that over the period of time, over the last few centuries, when sovereignty has been spoken about and written about, its meaning has changed. And I think the point that is made by some of the speakers, that we do live in a very different world today than people inhabited 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, has an impact on the notion of sovereignty. On the other hand, clearly sovereignty still continues. We cherish the notion of independence and nationhood. It's still there. It resonates in our political consciousness. And it's that difficult balance that we somehow have to come to terms with.
Now, what's been talked about in the program is very much political processes, judicial processes, but of course these things have wider ramifications also in terms of economic integration and ecological and environmental questions. I mean, do they have to do with the growth of international institutions of this kind, which continually regulate areas of life which formerly were very much up to the individual decisions of nation states?
I think clearly so. I mean, we see it in the world all around us. I think Britain is a member of a whole variety of multinational organizations. Clearly, the European community is the most important of these organizations, and they have become an important factor in the globe, in the world, in regulating a whole variety of aspects of British life. I think the theme of the local and the global is clearly illustrated there.
And what's your guess about the balance of public opinion in Britain? I mean, after all, in the programme we have 4 senior political figures who belong actually to different political affiliations, expressing very different views about how important this partial loss of sovereignty is. What do you think, where do you think the common sense of British opinion currently lies in this issue?
I think this is a difficult one, but my sense is that most probably there's been a greater appreciation of the European community in recent years. And that appears to be the kind of developing trend towards attitudes on the European community. Whether that continues or not, of course, is a matter which is difficult to speculate on.
Richard, thank you very much. Next week, we're going to look at a comparative study of the policies and practices of equal opportunity, comparing the United States and the United Kingdom.
Stage of being able to say convenablement, comme il convient sur les conseguenze giuridiche di una risposta affermativa alla prima domanda pregiudiziale.
In diesem Sinne gegebenen Beantwortung der Fragen. Ich möchte diese beiden Aspekte nacheinander behandeln. Zuerst also zu den möglichen